That night I ignored the mafia boss the entire evening. It wasn't until the bar was about to close that he finally lifted his gaze from his glass of wine and spoke, his voice low, deep, and quiet enough to freeze the whole room. From now on, she serves only me. No one laughed. No one dared to breathe. And I, just a bar waitress at Velvet Ember, suddenly became the center of every fearful, hungry stare in the room. I thought he was joking. But those eyes, cold and disturbingly familiar, told me otherwise. He didn't choose me for amusement. He chose me for another reason entirely. Before I tell you exactly what happened next, and how that one sentence changed everything I thought I knew about survival, I just need a quick moment. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you were overlooked or invisible, would you pause right now, open your phone and hit that like button? Leave a quick comment below. Maybe just tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel, so we can keep sharing these hard-won stories. That one little click helps me more than you know, and it means we can keep building this space where every voice, especially the quiet ones, gets heard. Thank you. Now back to the kind of trouble you never see coming, the kind that walks right up to your table and claims you. The manager, a man named Gary, who sweated profusely even in the chilled, perfectly controlled air of the Ember, went instantly alarmingly pale, the color draining so fast from his face that the overhead track lighting seemed to make his suddenly slick skin shine with existential fear. It wasn't just confusion. It was the kind of total paralyzing panic that ripples through people when they realize they've miscalculated something fundamental about their universe, like a stable concrete floor suddenly giving way beneath their expensive Italian leather shoes. Gary looked first at the boss, Dante Romano, whose very name was a hushed, reverent, and deeply terrifying word whispered among the city's elite. Then he looked at me, just a girl in a cheap, slightly frayed black uniform carrying a nearly empty tray, and he genuinely looked like he might actually throw up right there on the pristine, high-gloss marble floor. Dante didn't raise his voice, didn't shift in his custom-made leather booth, and didn't move a single muscle. The frightening stillness of his posture somehow more profoundly commanding than any shout or threat could ever be. But the entire room, which was usually a reassuringly loud, low thrum of expensive, self-satisfied conversation, and the rhythmic clinking of ice against crystal, had gone completely, unnervingly silent. My coworker, a woman named Vanessa, who had spent the entire shift mocking me with a steady stream of sharp, passive-aggressive comments about my profound lack of sparkle and ambition, suddenly backed up 2 panicked steps, her high, brittle smile dissolving entirely as her silver serving pen dropped onto the marble floor with a sharp, tiny clink that felt deafening in the sudden void of noise. I didn't drop my tray, though. My hands were trained years of necessity, forging a quiet, almost mechanical resilience in my movements. And I kept my balance, something I'd learned to do years ago, when the ground literally fell out from under me in a chaos I couldn't yet fully recall a time I'd forced myself to forget. I just stood my ground, staring back at him, meeting the absolute steel coldness of his gaze, and forcing my expression to remain flat and utterly unreadable, wondering if this grand public pronouncement was merely an elaborate power play to publicly punish me for my oversight, or if he was genuinely mad that I had pointedly ignored his table all night, focusing instead on the noisy hedge fund guys and the regular patrons who actually tipped well enough to keep me and my sister afloat, pushing us toward Nora's architectural degree, one $10 bill at a time. I had spent the last 5 long years of my life perfecting the subtle, exhausting necessary art of being invisible, of simply fading into the background of high-end establishments, like Velvet Ember, where people only ever saw what you were bringing them, the $100 bottle of vintage champagne, the single malt whiskey that cost more than my entire weekly food budget, or the final daunting bill, and never the actual person holding the tray. Dante Romano had been sitting in his usual corner booth since 9 that evening, dominating the vast room with his sheer, silent, imposing presence, surrounded by a few men whose bespoke suits cost more than my annual rent, and I had deliberately meticulously circled him, serving every other table twice, sometimes 3 times, while meticulously avoiding eye contact and keeping my back turned whenever possible. Why the deep-seated fear, the calculated avoidance? Because the way he looked cold, intensely searching, and yet somehow burdened with an unseen history, was too much like the way certain people had looked at me a long time ago. A familiar, deep-seated threat. Or maybe like something he was desperately trying to place a nagging echo in his memory that I absolutely didn't want him to identify or confirm. It wasn't until just an hour earlier, right before the kitchen closed, that Vanessa had leaned in her breath, smelling faintly of cheap, sugary gum, right as I was polishing a delicate, expensive wine glass behind the bar, and whispered a cruel, cutting joke laced with pure malice. "Don't serve the boss, and you'll serve unemployment instead, Hart. You're too quiet for this place anyway. He likes women with fire, not mice, so stick to the retirees. They're the only ones who won't notice your poverty." I had just kept scrubbing the glass, ignoring her palpable insecurity, and the manager's frantic, silent signals for me to attend to the dawn, knowing I needed this job more than I needed to placate anyone's ego or survive a minor humiliation. The tuition for Nora, my little sister, was due in 3 short weeks, and the shame of being fired publicly wasn't nearly as bad as the far greater fear of being truly seen by him. But now it didn't matter anymore. He had seen me, and his quiet, terrifying decree had sealed my fate, turning me instantly and publicly from the invisible, easily dismissed waitress into something reserved, something possessed, and under his immediate, inescapable command. My shift ended exactly 15 minutes after Dante Romano issued that chilling decree, but I couldn't possibly leave. Gary, the manager, was still frozen solid in his spot near the maitre de stand, utterly unable to move or even speak his body language, communicating only utter existential terror and professional ruin. So Dante's right-hand man, a sleek, watchful guy named Marco Valenti, took immediate control of the silent situation. Marco approached me with a predatory, unsettling grace, all-expensive Italian cologne, and a calculated professional smile that didn't remotely reach his hard, dark, watchful eyes. He didn't touch me, not then, and never in a way that couldn't be described as accidental to an outsider. But he moved so close that the very air pressure around me shifted and tightened, and I could feel the cold, absolute confidence rolling off him in waves, the kind of self-assurance that comes from absolute power. "The boss is leaving, Lena," he murmured, using my name in a way that felt less like a simple greeting, and more like a permanent, indelible command, a possessive brand. "Your belongings are packed. You ride with us." I didn't argue. Arguing with anyone from this untouchable world, especially in that establishment, would have been a guaranteed explosion of unwanted attention, and I was already in enough profound trouble just by existing and being noticed. I simply reached for the frayed strap of my old crossbody bag, the only thing I owned that still smelled a little like my old life, a faint, comforting scent of sea air and cheap soap, and placed it over my shoulder with a deliberate, slow, and unwavering movement that betrayed none of my inner turmoil. I met Marco's gaze for just a fraction of a second, an instant long enough to let him see the blank, unyielding calm in my eyes, the absolute absence of the expected panic he was searching for, and then I walked calmly out of Velvet Ember, never looking back at Gary's horrified, ruined face, or Vanessa's jaw-dropped, bitter shock. As I stepped onto the slick, rainy pavement of the alleyway behind the bar, the cold, unwelcome air hitting my face with the brutal reality of the moment, I knew my life as the invisible waitress, Lena Hart, was irrevocably over. I was now a captive, stepping willingly into the expensive, dangerous cage of Dante Romano, and the weight of the entire city, both its obscene wealth and its hidden darkness, settled upon me like a heavy, suffocating cloak. The journey to the mansion was long and terrifyingly silent, driven by Marco in a black sedan that felt unnervingly like a soundproof coffin, every mile taking me further from Nora and the life we had scraped together. The next morning, everything about my stark reality was drastically different. The rules of the world had completely inverted. Dante hadn't harmed me, hadn't laid a finger on me, in fact. He hadn't even spoken a word to me after the command that night. He was treating me not as a cheap conquest, but as an object of profound, deep, and dangerous curiosity, a puzzle he was determined to solve. Marco drove me straight to a massive, secluded limestone mansion, perched high in the hills. One of those places you only read about in glossy society magazines, where the iron gates were taller than I was, and the opulent silence felt like a physical, heavy presence. I was given a small, clinically clean room in the private staff quarters, a place of oppressive, starched, antiseptic luxury, and then the background check came back. I knew this because later that afternoon, Marco returned to my room. His smooth mask slightly shifted the corner of his mouth. Tight, a definite flicker of something uneasy, a dawning realization in his watchful eyes. Dante had ordered a full sweep, a forensic invasive look at Lena Hart, the unassuming waitress, and the results, whatever hidden details they contained, must have profoundly startled him. I was quietly informed by a very serious-looking older woman in charge of the domestic staff that I wasn't returning to Velvet Ember. Instead, I was being hired officially legally, and with a ridiculous, staggering salary that made my eyes widen and then narrow with suspicion, knowing the money was simply another chain as Dante's personal server for his private banquets and formal dinners. The new arrangement was clearly a cover, a flimsy veneer of legitimacy over a dark, specific intention, but for what ultimate terrifying purpose? My new colleagues, the highly trained domestic staff, were not welcoming in the slightest. They knew the whispers, the outlandish story of the waitress plucked from the bar, and their malicious envy was immediate and poisonous. The boss likes exotic toys for a season, something to amuse him until the new shipment arrives. They muttered behind thin, polite hands, their fear mixed with outright contempt, watching me like a hawk for any sign of weakness, desperation, or the confirmation of their sordid gossip. The first big dinner I served at the mansion was terrifying, an agonizingly long, grueling test of my nerves and composure, forcing me to operate under the most intense scrutiny of my life. It was a formal gathering of about 20 powerful, intimidating people-men in bespoke suits, their silk ties muted but expensive, and women dripping in diamonds that reflected the enormous chandelier light, casting them in cold, brilliant relief, all moving with a strange, predatory, almost theatrical grace that felt completely unnatural and unsettling. My job was simple, dictated by a severe head butler named Mr. Finch, who looked like he hated the world, stay near Dante's chair, anticipate his needs with absolute robotic precision, and otherwise be a statue, silent, unmoving, and utterly unnoticeable. I wore a plain gray silk dress provided by the house's wardrobe department, which was meant to be a high-end uniform, but felt more like a heavy, shimmering cage binding me to my new role. As I walked the periphery of the enormous dining room, my movements were silent and economical, and I could feel Dante's eyes constantly tracking me, not with lust or anger, but with an intense, surgical, cold focus, like a detective studying a photograph he thought he recognized from a decade-old crime scene. My hands thankfully were rock steady as I poured water and cleared plates, the practiced movements maintaining the quiet dignity that was my only remaining defense in this overwhelming hostile environment. When I approached his chair to refill his wine, a blood-red, heavy-aged Bordeaux that smelled faintly of leather and earth, he didn't lift his glass or acknowledge the wine bottle in my hand. He just leaned in slightly, his body language deliberately intimate, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that only I could possibly hear above the polished murmur of the room, asking me a question that instantly stopped my breath and chilled my heart. "Who taught you to hide fear so well?" he murmured, not taking his eyes off the deep ruby color of the wine bottle, studying my reflection in the glass. It was a question that didn't just pierce my professional composure. It cut right through my deepest armor, touching on a core survival skill I had developed in the absolute worst, most chaotic, world-ending moment of my life. A moment that had left me with only fragmented, searing memories and a heavy, persistent sense of guilt that I carried everywhere I went. I paused, the open wine bottle held perfectly still just above the rim of his glass, the expensive liquid trembling slightly in the neck from the sudden cessation of movement. And I knew instantly that I couldn't lie to him. Not in this controlled, intimate, high-stakes moment. I couldn't give him a manufactured defensive answer. It would have been instantly exposed as weak. I decided instead to give him the simple, devastating, hard truth, the mantra I had repeated to myself in the mirror every morning for years, as I prepared to face another day of being relentlessly overlooked. I met his intense gaze, briefly confirming the intuitive suspicion I'd had since he first spoke that possessive word in the bar. He was searching for a ghost from his past, desperately trying to make the disjointed pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle fit together. I leaned in just enough, matching his hushed tone with a voice that was almost terrifyingly calm. for my violently racing heart, a voice that sounded utterly resigned to its truth. I just learned how to survive. I said the 4 simple words, sounding worn and impossibly heavy like a smooth river stone, polished by years of relentless, unforgiving current. The instant the words left my mouth, I saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in his iron composure, a ghost of recognition that flashed across his eyes and was instantly suppressed, followed by a flicker of profound buried pain and understanding. He immediately straightened up in his seat, his eyes now cold and hard, again the mask of the powerful Dawn snapping back into place with a definitive click, and he took the glass from my hand, dismissing the moment and the dangerous intimacy. He didn't say another word, but the profound message of that exchange was clear and chilling. That specific phrase, that single, simple declaration of enduring hardship, had been identical to something someone from his past, someone he considered a grave, absolute traitor, had once said to him. Now he was convinced beyond doubt. I wasn't just a random waitress, he fancied. I was undeniably connected to the betrayal that haunted him, the catastrophic explosion 5 years ago that had irrevocably taken his entire family. My new, unbelievably luxurious prison had just gotten a lot smaller, the walls closing in with terrifying speed, and the danger surrounding me had become infinitely more personal and lethal than I had initially imagined. The investigation period, or perhaps I should more accurately describe it as the elaborate, cruel charade of surveillance and emotional pressure, didn't last long after that chilling dinner exchange. Soon after my quiet admission, I was abruptly moved again this time, relocated to a specific separate wing of the mansion, a wing that was even more isolated and inaccessible. There were no more banquets, no more serving duties. My utility as a high-status domestic asset had served its purpose. I was strictly installed in the most private servants' quarters, a suite of rooms that were still impeccably clean and infinitely nicer than the tiny rundown apartment I shared with Nora, but now they were under explicit, palpable, silent guard. I wasn't allowed to leave the compound walls. My movements were heavily restricted to the grounds and a small walled garden that felt more like a beautifully manicured holding pen and my only vital link to the outside world. My cheap old cell phone I used to call Nora was constantly malfunctioning, dropping calls, refusing to load messages, and generally rendering itself useless when I needed it most. I was a caged prey animal, and the mockery from the few staff I did interact with intensified sharply, now fueled not just by general envy, but by the deeper mystery of my rapid, strange ascent, and even quicker unexplained confinement to this luxurious quarantine. The little waitress dreams of being queen, but look where she landed, a royal playpen. They'd snicker when they thought I was out of earshot, their words echoing the constant, dull, grinding humiliation of being stripped of all my autonomy and agency. I held my head high, walking past their judgment, as if it were nothing more than an unpleasant, meaningless gust of wind. My greatest consuming fear, though, wasn't for myself or my uncomfortable living situation. It was all for Nora, the thought of her exposed and vulnerable. When my vital phone call to her cut out abruptly, the line going dead right in the middle of her excited description of an architectural assignment she had finally aced, I didn't need a formal announcement to understand the new, horrifying terms of my captivity. We were both being watched, and my gilded cage was also hers, a terrifying extension of my personal prison. That devastating realization, the absolute knowledge that my younger sister was now leverage against me, a silent threat held in reserve, was the inevitable, crushing breaking point. Being threatened with my own safety is one thing. Having my sister held over me, a defenseless pawn in a brutal game I didn't ask to play, was an entirely different, unforgivable offense that solidified my purpose. I knew with absolute certainty that I had to escape immediately, not just for the faint hope of personal freedom, but primarily to draw the intense, lethal attention away from Nora and the promising, innocent life she was painstakingly building. My chance came late one night after weeks of patient observation, when the usual guard rotation shifted slightly, leaving a single blind minute between patrols near the old laundry entrance, the most neglected corner of the vast property. I used a small vital trick I hadn't needed since I was a scared kid, sleeping on city buses, a thin, sharpened metal spike I always kept hidden securely in the sole of my worn old shoe, to silently pick the ancient stiff lock on the servants' entrance leading out to the deep walled gardens. The air outside was cool and thick with the heavy, intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine, the darkness offering a sudden intense comfort and anonymity, and the distant shimmering city lights felt like an absolute beckoning salvation, a beacon of normalcy and escape. I was running, pushing my tired legs faster than they wanted to go, the rough grass scraping my exposed ankles when a strong, brutal, and utterly silent hand grabbed the back of my dress, the sudden violent force yanking me backward with dizzying speed. It was Marco. He had been waiting, calculating my exact move, his sophisticated smile gone replaced by a cold, murderous, furious sneer of contempt. He didn't waste time with words or threats, just threw me hard onto the cold, unforgiving cobblestone path near the ornamental fountain. The fall was painful, knocking the entire wind out of my lungs in a sharp, agonizing burst, leaving me breathless and dizzy. It was a deliberate, vicious, and very public humiliation, designed with cold precision to shatter my quiet defiance and violently remind me of my absolute contemptible place in their hierarchy. And then as I gasped desperately for air, Dante appeared stepping silently out from the deepest shadows near the fountain, bathed in the cool, indifferent, unforgiving light of the full moon. He didn't look angry, though I braced myself for a towering rage. He looked profoundly, terrifyingly disappointed, which was somehow 10 times worse, far more chilling than any overt fury could have been. He glanced down at me, sprawled weakly on the cold, hard stones, then briefly at Marco, who stood perfectly still, his job done and finally back at me, his gaze entirely unpitying and absolute. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, trying with shaking hands to cover the ripping sound. The expensive silk dress had just made a sound of ruin that echoed the state of my immediate future. Dante's voice, when it came, was flat, devoid of any discernible human emotion, a hollow, empty tone that chilled me to the core more effectively than Marco's brute force ever could. "Run again and I'll find your sister first," he said. It wasn't framed as a desperate, frustrated threat. It was delivered with the chilling, absolute finality of a judge reading a death sentence, a calm, terrible promise he would certainly keep without blinking. The meaning was devastatingly clear, slicing through my last reserves of hope I could choose to chase my past freedom or secure Nora's future safety. But I absolutely couldn't have both. From that shattering moment on, I wasn't just a simple captive. I was an expendable toy, with a rapidly approaching expiration date, utterly forced to play his dangerous high-stakes game until he successfully extracted the answers he needed. I stood up slowly, deliberately refusing to accept Marco's offered mocking hand, brushing the painful grit from the torn silk with a hand that barely trembled. I met Dante's eye with a fierce, unwavering calm, and this time, the composure I showed him wasn't an act of desperate defiance, but a necessary, painful act of protection for the only family I had left. I realized I had nowhere left to run, no escape route that didn't lead to Nora's downfall, so I made the hard, calculated choice. I decided to stand perfectly still and fight the unseen battle for truth from within his own fortress, where I could at least keep watch. The quiet, desperate resolve to stay and investigate gave me limited, dangerous access, and I began to explore the hidden underbelly of the mansion with meticulous, covert focus, turning the staff work into intelligence gathering. I started doing small, seemingly useful and highly time-consuming tasks that made me appear less like a suspicious prisoner and more like an extremely useful high-status domestic asset, sorting massive stacks of non-confidential documents into chronological order, organizing his huge private library of rare books and journals, and most crucially being granted periodic unsupervised access into his inner study when he was guaranteed to be out on business for hours at a time. I wasn't looking for escape plans anymore. My entire focus had narrowed entirely to the truth of 5 years ago, the raw truth that held Nora hostage, and had kept me running for half a decade with fragmented memories. One long, tense afternoon, while carefully putting away a stack of old financial files into a dusty built-in cabinet behind a loose panel, I found it. Hidden deep within a black leather dossier labeled simply PR, was an old, faded but heartbreakingly clear photograph of my mother. My breath caught sharp and painful in my chest, a sudden brutal shock that felt like a physical blow blurring my vision. She was younger in the photo, radiant and absolutely happy, laughing with genuine abandon, standing next to a younger, less scarred and undeniably happy Dante Romano, their bodies leaning into each other with an intimacy that spoke volumes. They weren't just acquaintances or business partners. They were clearly something profound, something deeply intimate, loving, and destined. The accompanying file meticulously detailed her involvement in his life, her eventual role in his organization as an informant inside a rival faction, and then the brutal factual report on the explosion, its horrific aftermath, and her supposed treachery in planting the bomb. I realized with a violent, sickening jolt that Dante hadn't just suspected my mother of being a political traitor. He had genuinely loved her completely, utterly, and he believed she had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible, leading directly to the death of his family members and the total destruction of his trust and his life. The file itself contained more than just the photograph. It was a biography of his pain, a meticulous tracking of her movements, her coded messages, and the official investigation's conclusion that placed her squarely at the heart of the conspiracy. He had never been able to let her go, which explained why he was so obsessed with me, the daughter who echoed her quiet demeanor and haunting eyes. His pursuit wasn't about finding a woman. It was about laying the ghost of his past to rest, either by confirming my mother's guilt through my own perceived treachery, or by finally finding the truth she died trying to protect. The sheer weight of his grief and suspicion laid out across those brittle pages was almost overwhelming, but it gave me a critical advantage. I knew his vulnerability. However, Marco's ever-present vigilance, a quiet, watchful pressure, was constant and merciless, like a suffocating blanket. He must have reported my unusual extended movements in the study, perhaps noting the increased time I spent alone with the files, because Dante came back hours early that evening, his face a sudden terrifying thundercloud, a perfect reflection of the dark storm that had been brewing in his mind for 5 years. He didn't announce himself. He just stood silently in the massive doorway, his figure blocking the last sliver of evening light, watching me hold the fragile, painful photograph like a piece of glass. The air in the study instantly turned toxic, heavy, with unspoken accusation and suppressed violence, the atmosphere crackling with unspent energy. I didn't try to hide the picture, realizing instantly that attempting concealment would only confirm his darkest fears. I just laid it gently openly on the immense dark mahogany desk. "You're the daughter of that traitorous woman," he stated, his voice impossibly low, vibrating with a dangerous, controlled fury, a simple, cold affirmation of everything he had believed and felt for half a decade, his voice dangerously even. I braced myself, knowing this was the critical life-or-death moment. This was the moment I expected him to order my death, the final unforgivable consequence of my mother's perceived sins finally coming due. He took a single slow step closer, his hand subtly moving toward the coat pocket, where I knew he carried a small, heavy piece of metal, a final gesture of judgment. But I spoke first, my voice ringing clear and steady in the deadly silence, cutting directly through the thick, suffocating tension of his rage with the surgical precision of a scalpel. The explosives weren't placed in the north wall, where the official records say, "Dante," I stated, using his name for the first time, with a sudden deliberate intimacy, looking straight into his burning, analytical eyes, my hands resting calmly openly on the edge of the desk, a gesture of absolute unassailable truth. They were placed with meticulous precision under the foundation of the east wing, right where the servant stairwell met the cellar. The collapse was deliberately designed to look like an accidental structural failure caused by the north wall blast, the decoy, not the epicenter. I even added a detail that flashed through my fragmented memory, a terrifying sensory recall. There was a faint smell of industrial solvent there just hours before. The effect of those simple, precise new details was instantaneous and utterly profound. Dante froze entirely in his track, his hand hovering mid-air over his pocket, the murderous rage in his eyes visibly replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness, a sudden crystalline clarity of focus. That specific, brutal detail, the placement under the East Wing foundation. The solvent smell was a devastating truth that only 3 people had ever known, 2 of whom were confirmed dead in the blast, and one who was supposed to be completely gone forever, having only survived because she was meant to be running an errand far from the house. It was a detail so specific, so utterly unnecessary to the public, or even the internal private report of the incident, that no external investigation or general search could have ever possibly uncovered it. My fragmented memories, those persistent, hazy, terrifying nightmares I'd suffered since I was 21, had just in that single instant become my most powerful shield and my only weapon. I wasn't just the grieving daughter of a suspected traitor anymore. I was the only living, breathing witness who could unravel the 5-year-old brutal lie, the human key to the massive conspiracy that had utterly destroyed his entire world. His anger didn't miraculously vanish, but its intense, lethal focus shifted violently, turning outward toward the real, unseen enemies he now knew were still actively lurking in his inner circle. He didn't order my death. He didn't even yell. He just slowly lowered his hand from his pocket, his eyes burning with a terrifying, consuming new curiosity, a hunger for final absolute truth that eclipsed all else. I had survived that critical moment, and in doing so, I had fundamentally transformed myself from an unfortunate casualty into a vital, irreplaceable asset, moving one crucial step closer to earning my freedom through the dangerous game of truth and intelligence gathering. The revelation of my truth and the subsequent difficult, intense hours spent in Dante's presence irrevocably changed the dynamics of the house and inevitably the politics of the entire underworld network. I was now spending increasing hours with Dante, not in the subservient role of a server, but in the intense, high-stakes capacity of an interrogator and partner, a quiet researcher, who also happened to organize his highly confidential paperwork, my hands now touching secrets instead of silverware. We would pore over old files, ancient architectural maps of the destroyed building, and recent financial ledgers, trying to meticulously piece together the precise sequence of events that had led to the initial explosion and its calculated cover-up, working in an uneasy yet strangely productive silence. The dramatic shift in my status, my sudden unexplained elevation from disgrace to trusted confidant, caused a predictable, furious ripple of bitter rumors and gossip among the house staff and beyond. The servants whispered constantly, their malice amplified by their perceived injustice. "The boss sleeps with the traitor's daughter." "It's pure lunacy," they hissed in the back hallways, and the rumor quickly spread into the broader network, threatening to fatally undermine Dante's carefully constructed image of cold, ruthless discipline and absolute control. His reputation began to violently collapse, not because of a weakness in his strategy, but because of his perceived weakness for me, the girl, the daughter of the woman who had ostensibly betrayed him. This was the most constant, insidious, and painful form of humiliation, being reduced to a mere scandalous footnote, a cheap symbol of his supposed fallibility, a scarlet letter on his powerful, dangerous chest that everyone saw and judged, believing he was too weak to see his own ruin. The pressure of my presence and the collapsing reputation reached its inevitable head at a formal diplomatic banquet, held at the mansion, a necessary public show of force and stability that Dante needed to maintain control. I was permitted, even instructed, to attend, standing discreetly near Dante, observing the guests with the quiet intensity of a predator in disguise, noting every shift in expression. This time I wasn't wearing a uniform. I was in a simple, well-tailored black dress that didn't draw unwarranted attention, but also didn't apologize for my new precarious presence. As I stood near a glittering group of wives and entitled socialites, their massive diamond rings catching the enormous chandelier light, one particularly vicious entitled woman, with eyes that held the cold, shallow cruelty of inherited wealth, and no hardship, approached me with clear malicious intent. Her name was Serena, the wife of a powerful but deeply insecure council member, and she was clearly trying to test the exact limits of Dante's control and my status in the most publicly embarrassing way possible. She stopped directly in front of me, holding a glass of deep red wine, the very same Bordeaux I had poured for Dante weeks earlier, and pretended a clumsy, dramatic, exaggerated stumble. Her hand flailed wildly, deliberately, and the wine splashed down the entire front of my black dress, staining the expensive silk immediately in a horrifying, visible dark crimson spread. The room didn't fall completely silent this time. Instead, a sickening collective ripple of quiet, suppressed laughter and knowing smirks swept through the carefully curated guests, their malice palpable. It was a calculated, deliberate, and deeply public act of contempt and dismissal orchestrated for maximum audience engagement and my utter disgrace. I felt the sudden shocking coldness of the red wine soaking into the expensive fabric and the icy collective chill of their collective amusement, but I did not react in the way any of them expected or desired. I didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't utter a sound, and most importantly, I absolutely did not look down at the stain, refusing to acknowledge the success of her tactic. I looked straight at Serena, whose triumphant, smug sneer was momentarily frozen on her face, waiting for me to crumble to cry, or to apologize for the mess I had supposedly caused. Dante was standing across the massive room, engaged in a critical, low-voiced conversation with a nervous-looking senator, and I could feel the intense weight of his gaze on me, silent and utterly unreadable in the distance. Later, he confirmed what I already suspected: he hadn't intervened because this entire incident was a calculated test, a high-stakes risk to see who among his allies would dare to show their immediate hostility toward me, and by devastating extension toward his authority in choosing me. But in that humiliating moment, seeing the smug, satisfied cruelty on Serena's face, it felt like an absolute, profound abandonment. After the party finally cleared out, after I had spent an hour meticulously scrubbing the wine out of the unforgiving silk with a dry cleaning pen until my fingers ached, and the stain was barely a shadow, I found him in his private study. I didn't bring up the wine stain or Serena's cruelty. I just stood silently in the doorway watching him review ledgers and ask the only question that mattered to my shattered pride and uncertain future, the question that demanded a definition. "What am I to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, raw and completely stripped of my usual professional detachment. He didn't even lift his eyes from his papers. He said nothing. Just a heavy, tactical silence that hung in the air like thick, acrid smoke. A silence that offered no definition, no promise, and no protection. That critical moment, his devastating refusal to define me, to publicly protect me, or to finally claim me as anything other than an asset, was the precise instant I stopped waiting for his permission to act. I realized that if he wouldn't actively fight for me and define my place, I had to immediately begin fighting for myself and create my own power. I began my own fiercely independent investigation that very night, planting a small, sensitive listening bug in the luxury sedan and garage of Marco Valenti, the man who had brutally thrown me onto the cobblestones, and tracking suspicious shell company financial transactions through an old forgotten laptop I found hidden in the back of the library archives. My secret, desperate investigation soon paid off in horrifying, undeniable detail, revealing a complex web of financial transfers that led straight to an obscure anonymous shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. And from there, the trail led directly to a known, vengeful rival of Dante's, Vincent Moretti, one of the few lucky survivors of the original explosion 5 years ago, the one who escaped the initial reckoning. The connection was undeniable, a cold, hard line of deceit running from Marco's personal accounts, and the true source of the 5-year-old betrayal suddenly became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't my mother, whose love was tragically misunderstood and whose actions were a desperate shield. It was Marco operating with a ruthless, self-serving logic. He was the opportunistic, outwardly loyal, and ultimately calculating right-hand man, secretly in cahoots with the very man who wanted Dante dead and his empire dismantled. The profound, nauseating irony of Marco's sickening betrayal, especially after all his years of performative loyalty and the constant judgment he threw my way, was breathtakingly complete. I worked feverishly over the next 48 hours, adrenaline replacing sleep and fear, meticulously recording Marco's late-night hushed phone calls in the garage. I managed to capture the crucial, damning details of his final deal with Vincent, including the massive upcoming weapons shipment schedule, concrete, irrefutable evidence of treason, and a pending violent attack designed to collapse the Romano organization entirely. But in my haste and desperation to secure the evidence, I pushed too far too fast. I tried to hack directly into Dante's highly encrypted internal communications system, intending to anonymously upload the evidence directly to his main secure server before he left for the scheduled meeting. And that's the moment the system's defensive protocol tripped, and the security grid caught the unauthorized breach. I heard the quiet, definitive click of the massive oak study door closing behind me, and the low, subtle hum of the security system re-engaging, locking us in the room. I didn't even need to turn around to know the person standing there was Dante, his intuition sharp and immediate. He saw the hacked terminal, the frantic, unauthorized code flashing red on the screen, and the familiar look in his eyes was instantly lethal cold and absolute. He thought I was finally confirming his deepest fear, showing my true colors, confirming his darkest suspicion that I was indeed my mother's daughter, a traitor in the making, completing the cycle of deceit. He didn't speak a single word, allowing the terror to settle, just walked slowly, deliberately towards me, his movement terrifyingly measured and final. I knew instinctively that words wouldn't work now. Only definitive, shocking action based on irrefutable truth would possibly save me and Nora. I quickly unplugged the laptop, pulled out the small, vital voice recorder I had retrieved from the garage, my final card, and walked directly past him without a single word, not even glancing at his face. I went straight to the large oak-paneled room where a critical weekly meeting of the Romano Council, the very men who gossiped about me and judged my worth, was already in session, a gathering of the most powerful and ruthless figures in his organization. I didn't wait for an introduction, a moment of silence, or anyone's permission. I simply walked directly to the center of the massive conference table, placed the voice recorder down, and with a steady hand that surprised even myself, pressed play. The crackling, horrifying recording instantly filled the room, Marco's voice, smooth, calculating, and chillingly clear, discussing the weapons delivery logistics, with Vincent Moretti, sealing his own fate with every desperate, incriminating word of his betrayal. The absolute silence that followed the recording was heavier, deeper, and far more terrifying than any shout or argument could have ever been. The rigid faces of the council members, who had spent the last few weeks viewing me as a scandalous distraction and a political liability, were now frozen in a collective mixture of disbelief, shock, and dawning terror, as they realized the depth of the rot within their own walls. Then Marco, who had been sitting calmly at the table, stood up violently, knocking his heavy mahogany chair backward with a deafening crash, his smooth facade crumbling entirely into panicked, desperate desperation. He started babbling incoherently, pleading for mercy, offering convoluted, impossible explanations and immediate useless betrayals of his own to save his skin, his eyes flicking frantically between Dante and the stony-faced council members who now viewed him with revulsion. Dante didn't move an inch. He stood directly behind me, his powerful presence a literal, unyielding wall of ice, allowing Marco to completely finish his pathetic, desperate plea, allowing the man to thoroughly hang himself with his own final damning words. Finally, Dante spoke, and his voice was devoid of any human warmth, pure, terrifying frost distilled into sound. He didn't say kill him or raise his voice because he didn't need to. He simply issued a flat clinical order to two of his most trusted men, detailing the precise logistics of Marco's final silent removal from the compound, a permanent disappearance that required no further discussion. There was no argument from anyone, no hesitation, no protest from the council. Marco Valenti, the outwardly loyal right-hand man and secret architect of the entire conspiracy, was purged instantly and absolutely, his humiliation, total and final. Then Dante turned slowly to face the council, his gaze sweeping over every man at the table, challenging them to defy him, and made a shocking declaration that cemented my new, impossible earned position. From now on, he said, his voice ringing with indisputable, chilling authority, she's not my servant. She's my ally. The council was utterly silenced, their judgment replaced by profound, fearful respect for the woman who saved the Dawn, not served him. I had ascended from a scandalous plaything and a piece of gossip to a recognized partner, not because of a fleeting romantic connection, but because I had delivered a damning concrete truth that decisively saved his empire. I had earned my value with cold evidence and brutal calculated risk, and the shame of the red wine stain was now erased by the blood of a traitor. My new status as the Silent Queen was indeed a poisoned chalice, an uneasy crown of thorns that drew more attention than my quiet demeanor could handle. I had earned a grudging, fearful respect from the council, yes, but that respect was deeply steeped in boiling envy, persistent suspicion, and a palpable sense of injustice from the old guard who believed I should have been swiftly punished, not elevated to a status they could never achieve. I was no longer mocked for being a humble waitress. I was now deeply resented for my unearned, inexplicable power, a testament to the old underworld rule that those who rise too fast invite the sharpest, most lethal envy. The alliance with Dante wasn't a romance. It was a partnership founded entirely on shared trauma, mutual suspicion, and a singular purpose working relentlessly together to hunt down the last remaining conspirator, Vincent Moretti, the one who orchestrated the entire mess. We were two scarred, desperate survivors focused on closing the 5-year-old wound that kept us both chained to the past. But Vincent, now fully exposed and running for his life, decided to strike at the only vulnerability he knew Dante truly possessed, the human element of attachment and affection. One cold, rainy evening, I received a chilling video message on the secure burner phone Dante had given me. It wasn't encrypted or hidden meaning, it was designed for maximum immediate psychological impact. It was Nora, my little sister, sitting tied up against a cinder block wall in a massive, desolate warehouse, her eyes wide and terrified, fixed on the camera. Vincent's voice, gravelly and thickened with triumphant malice, played over the raw sound of my sister's muffled crying and struggling, his victory sounding absolute. "Bring the queen or the girl dies." The brutal message concluded, the implication hanging in the air like gunpowder smoke, a clear demand for exchange. The color drained entirely from my face, leaving me feeling suddenly lightheaded and desperately sick, the world tipping sideways. This was the exact horrifying scenario I had feared from the very moment Dante's decree had pulled me into his orbit, Nora exposed and vulnerable. When I showed him the video, the quiet room immediately erupted into panic and heated volatile debate among his advisors. His senior advisors, the old guard who hated my new sudden influence, wasted no time, their voices filled with cold, calculated urgency. "Let the woman go, Dawn. Let them have the girl. Save the Empire." They urged, their voices heavy with the devastating implication that my sister's life was a small, acceptable price to pay for Dante's stability and continued reign, arguing my life was ultimately disposable. Dante stood absolutely silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the horrible, static image of Nora's terrified face on the small screen, his inner conflict visible only to me. In that moment of pure, agonizing crisis, I saw the hesitation in him, a profound human flicker of that terrible personal cost. He was visibly calculating the massive strategic loss versus the personal emotional cost of losing me, and the two considerations were violently tearing him apart. I saw the weakness, the terrible indecision, and I knew I couldn't wait for him to finally choose. His love for me was battling his duty, and I couldn't risk the outcome. I had to choose for myself, and for Nora. I walked toward him slowly, deliberately placing my hand lightly on his arm, the first time I had ever initiated such a simple, intimate touch, and spoke clearly, choosing my own fate and hopefully guaranteeing Nora's. "Let me go," I said, not as a desperate plea or a request, but as a final quiet command that brooked no argument. Everyone in the room assumed I was confirming their prejudice, that I was his Achilles' heel, walking willingly to my own destruction to save my sister, confirming their belief that love was definitively weakness in the underworld. But as I turned to walk out the door, ready to execute a meticulous, devastating plan that had been forming in the back of my mind since I saw the dockyard blueprints, I sent a quick, precise, secret text message to Dante, a message so specific and so cryptic that only he who had obsessively studied the explosion files with me would immediately understand it. It contained only 3 numbers, 16E19. It was the crucial coordinate, the location of the load-bearing supports closest to Nora, a plan to mirror the blast from 5 years ago, turning Vincent's own trap into his final grave, a comprehensive strategy designed to end the cycle of violence and betrayal, once and for all. I drove the burner car to the designated dockyard alone, navigating the winding, desolate roads under the cover of thick fog that rolled in from the sea, carrying nothing but a small, heavy satchel filled with precisely timed directional-shaped charges, explosives designed to collapse, not destroy. It was cold, brutally cold, and the air smelled heavily of diesel fuel, stagnant water and ancient rust, the classic isolating stench of the industrial waterfront. When I walked into the cavernous, echoing warehouse, Vincent was waiting framed in the single shaft of yellow dock lighting, holding a gun casually and confidently at Nora's head. She was slumped against a tall stack of moldy wooden crates, her face streaked with tears and dirt. But she looked up at the sound of my entrance with a sharp spark of desperate, heartbreaking hope. Vincent smiled a wide, ugly, self-satisfied grin, stretching across his scarred face, his eyes glinting with pure malevolence. The Queen came for her little sister. How profoundly touching, he mocked, gesturing grandly for me to drop the heavy satchel and approach him in the light. I didn't waste valuable time talking or debating his terms. I tossed the satchel, aiming it with precision, to slide directly under the very crates Nora was tied to the coordinates 16E19, confirming their stability as a shield. I then pretended a slow, utter surrender, walking slowly towards Vincent, my hands raised openly and clearly in the air. He immediately grabbed my arm with brutal force, wrenching it hard, and I felt the familiar cold steel of his gun press firmly against my temple, the heat of his breath foul and close. Just as he started his inevitable long-winded gloat detailing how satisfying it would be to finally erase the last remaining witness to his treachery, I triggered the preset directional blast with a hidden button I'd sewn into my cuff. It wasn't a massive, indiscriminate explosion meant for total destruction, but a focused, calculated detonation, the pressure directed solely at the unsecured rotten support columns, directly on Vincent's far side of the room, forcing a targeted collapse. The roar was instantaneous and deafening, the pressure waves slamming me backward violently. The crates shifted violently, but their bulk protected Nora. But Vincent was caught instantly in the structural collapse, screaming as massive beams and debris rained down upon him, the sound of his terror swallowed by the noise. Dante stormed in mere seconds later, appearing with his heavily armed men, like a terrifying disciplined storm front, bursting through the dockyard doors. But the fight was surprisingly already over. He ignored the confusion, the thick, choking smoke and the sound of falling, groaning metal rushing straight to where I lay injured. I was wounded, bleeding profusely from a deep, jagged laceration on my arm, caused by flying shrapnel debris, but I was utterly alive, the clarity of my survival absolute. He pulled me up, his arms strong and demanding, his face etched with raw, profound, uncontrolled fear, the face of a man who had almost lost everything he had left, a mirror of his pain, from 5 years ago. Nora was already being untied by his men, coughing, but otherwise safe. I looked up at him, the heavy smoke stinging my eyes, and knew this was the final defining moment, the terrifying honest truth that needed to be spoken over the ringing silence left by the blast. I pulled his face close to mine, whispering the words over the sudden, intense rush of my own adrenaline and relief. My mother faked the betrayal. I choked out the crucial words, catching on the blood in my mouth, the confession tasting like salt and regret. She gave you the wrong intelligence, but only to lure Marco and Vincent into that disastrous meeting, hoping you would execute them both instantly. She thought she was saving you from the traitors she couldn't openly identify. Marco and Vincent, they were the only real ones. She died trying to protect you, not betray you. The words were a final, painful confession that even in the chaos healed an old, deep, festering wound. Dante's iron composure shattered completely. He finally understood the years of devastating guilt he had carried, the self-reproach, the agonizing belief that the woman he loved had doomed him. It was all built on a calculated, manipulative, long-game lie, designed by the real traitors. He pulled me closer, burying my face deep into the expensive, now smoke-stained leather of his jacket, rocking me slightly, his entire body trembling. "You will never serve anyone again," he whispered fiercely, his voice shaking with a depth of emotion I had never heard him possess, a raw, protective finality, not even me. Nora was rescued alive, though deeply shaken by the ordeal. Vincent's body was unsettlingly never definitively found in the rubble of the dockyard, a fact that was unsettling, leaving a shadow of uncertainty. But for that singular burning moment, we were profoundly safe, standing together in the smoke and the wreckage. I survived the dockyard, but the cumulative, intense trauma of that night, coupled with the fragments of my suppressed past being violently forced back to the surface, resulted in a temporary, painful amnesia, a defense mechanism against overwhelming grief and violence. I knew who I was, Lena Hart. But the sharp, terrifying memories of Dante, the intricate details of the Mafia world, and the precise arc of the life I had just lived were hazy, fragmented like an old photograph bleached by relentless sun. Dante understanding with absolute clarity that the only way to truly free me was to sever every single thread connecting us to that dark existence, brought me to a quiet, isolated seaside monastery, nestled on a remote cliffside miles away from the polluted city air. He meticulously faked his own death, spending months dismantling his entire empire, dissolving assets, and ensuring his disappearance from the criminal world was absolute, public, and irreversible, becoming a legend of failure. He vanished entirely, leaving me nothing but a profound, aching sense of loss. I couldn't logically explain a hole in my heart I couldn't name or place. I spent the next year running a small, quiet cafe near the endless ocean, listening to the relentless, calming, repetitive sound of the waves. I was haunted by persistent dreams of fire, blood, and whispers, and a recurring intense vision of a table for two set against the sea. I served tourists and local fishermen living a simple, bloodless existence, working long hours. But the quiet peace felt acutely incomplete, like a beautiful song played without its essential melody. The underworld, of course, still whispered about the sudden, dramatic, and humiliating fall of Dante. Romano fell for a woman, that's his disgrace. The malicious rumors snaked through the city, claiming that his powerful reign had been ended by a single, quiet, unassuming waitress. I only remembered fragments, the sharp, authoritative command that started it all. She serves only me. And a powerful, haunting vision of a man walking directly through consuming fire for my safety. My life was peaceful, yes, but the hard-won freedom felt perpetually borrowed, not fully earned, knowing that the cost was his entire life. The past I knew in my soul still breathed, waiting for its chance to finally claim what was left of me. One rainy, gray afternoon, a little over a year after the dockyard explosion, the small brass bell above the cafe door tinkled gently, and a familiar deep shadow instantly filled the frame, eclipsing the light. I looked up distractedly from wiping down the counter, the motion slowing as the image registered. My heart stuttered violently, the familiar, incomplete ache in my chest tightening until I felt I couldn't possibly breathe, a primal recognition overriding the amnesia. Standing there was a man, older now, his face deeply lined and etched with scars, physical and otherwise, dressed in simple, well-worn clothes that smelled strongly of sea air and rain, not expensive Italian leather. He was no longer the imposing, terrifying Don, but he was undeniably completely him, the man from the dream. He walked quietly over to the counter, pulling up a wooden stool without asking permission, and his eyes, still deep and intensely focused, found mine, recognizing the soul beneath the memory loss. "Table for two." As always, he said, his voice the low, unforgettable rumble from the velvet ember bar that first defining night. He confessed then that he hadn't just faked his death to protect his empire or his name. He had done it solely to give me a life free of blood and titles, a normal, clean, anonymous existence, something he realized with brutal clarity he could never provide while standing at the very top of a criminal hierarchy. He was offering a life of shared simplicity, finally choosing peace over power, a clean start for both of us. But just as the fragile, difficult peace of that moment settled over us, just as I reached across the counter to touch his scarred hand, the past burst in violently, and without a single shred of mercy. Vincent Moretti, the persistent ghost who was never found in the rubble, had indeed survived. He had spent the last year tracking Dante down, intent on destroying the final piece of Dante's happiness and pride. That night, an hour after I had locked the doors, and we were talking quietly over leftover coffee, the small, quiet cafe suddenly and violently exploded around us, the sound a horrific, defining cracked glass, and wood tearing apart. Through the sudden smoke and the spreading flames, the familiar, terrifying chaos of the blast, my memories, all of them, 5 years of hidden trauma, betrayal, and unexpected, profound love, returned in a brutal, blinding flash of total recall, the shock of the blast undoing the amnesia. I remembered the dockyard, my mother's tragic sacrifice, the cold truth of the entire conspiracy, and the terrifying cold reality that Vincent would keep hunting us until one of us was finally dead. I looked at Dante, who was already moving with terrifying speed, his muscle memory honed by violence taking over, tossing me a small, heavy object from his pocket, a spare pistol he always carried even in civilian clothes. I caught it instinctively, the cold shape familiar in my hand, a gun. Vincent was approaching through the thick smoke and shifting debris, his face twisted in final triumphant malice. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I didn't think about vengeance or justice or morality. I thought only about Nora, the sea, the cafe, and the quiet, bloodless life we had already paid for with so much pain and sacrifice. I raised the gun and killed Vincent not for revenge, but to end the cycle, to finally stop the bleeding and the running and the constant fear. I looked at Dante, the gun heavy and hot in my hand, and the words that defined my entire journey came out not as a whisper, but as a resolute statement of final, powerful fact. I was your servant once I said, the smoke stinging my eyes, the adrenaline making my voice shake. Now I'm my own master. We serve no one except what we love. He stepped closer, taking the gun gently from my hand, his scarred face alight with profound understanding and respect. Then let's build a life where love needs no chains, he replied, and we walked away from the burning ashes, no crowns, no titles, no criminal empire left to claim us, but finally truly free. I lost a lot of important things in the fire, my mother, my past, my silence, but I gained something far more precious and absolute than anything the underworld could possibly offer. I gained myself whole and complete. I was measured by the world, judged by my cheap uniform, and confined by cruel circumstance. But I learned that true, unshakable strength isn't about the power you wield over others. It's about the dignity you manage to keep when everything you know is on fire. You were never small. You were never insignificant. You were just waiting for your moment to stand up. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.